Bilal Ahmed was born on a humid summer night in a tiny one-room house on the dusty outskirts of Karachi. His parents, Asif and Farida, lived in a row of similar brick homes that pressed tightly against one another like reluctant neighbors. The walls were thin, and at any hour of the day one could hear the rhythms of life all around, the distant hum of traffic on the highway, children's laughter echoing through narrow lanes, and the melodic call to prayer drifting down from the nearby mosque. Bilal's earliest memories were of sunlight filtering through a threadbare curtain, casting dancing patterns on the bare floor where he slept next to his two younger sisters. Their beds were nothing more than thin mats laid directly on the concrete, but on those mats they dreamed of a life that felt larger than their cramped quarters. From the first moments he could walk, Bilal was curious about how things worked. He would watch his father return home after a long day of labor at a brick kiln, his hands coated in red clay and his face marked by tired lines. As Asif collapsed into a wooden chair, Bilal would scurry to the corner where old radio sets lay, discarded. With slow, steady fingers, he would pry open the plastic case of a broken radio, studying each wire and circuit board as though reading the pages of a secret book. To him, those tangled wires were as exciting as any fairy tale. They held hidden potential. When the radio suddenly crackled to life under his careful hands, Bilal would dart out into the yard, holding it aloft, as though showing off a rare treasure. His mother always praised him softly, wiping her hands on her sari before wiping his forehead to cool the sweat that trickled down his temple in that hot climate. School was a mix of wonder and challenge for young Bilal. He attended a government-run primary school that sat a 15-minute walk from home. Along the way, he passed blistering tar roads where occasional cars splashed through muddy puddles, and donkey carts rumbled by, their wooden wheels clattering against potholes. The school itself was an old two-story building with peeling paint, and classrooms that often smelled faintly of damp chalk and mildew. Teachers sometimes arrived late, juggling lessons with personal worries, and supplies were scarce. But Bilal loved to learn. Even when the benches were worn and the textbooks tattered, he soaked up every lesson he could. Mathematics fascinated him, especially when numbers could describe the world around him. Yet more than any subject, it was the practical lessons during vocational classes that captured his imagination. Taking apart a bicycle wheel, learning how a chain fit into gears, understanding how a spark plug could light a fire within an engine. He watched every demonstration with rapt attention, scribbling notes in a small notebook, imagining how one day he might apply this knowledge to real machines. At home, money was always tight. Farida, Bilal's mother, tried to stretch resources by selling samosas to neighbors in the mornings before sunrise. She would wake long before anyone else, carefully measure flour and water to make the perfect dough, and then fill each triangular pocket with spicy potatoes before frying them golden brown. The scent of hot oil and spices would fill the cramped kitchen, drawing the children from their sleep. Bilal would offer to run errands, carrying a battered tin tray piled with samosas, through the sweltering streets weaving between vendors and vendors' carts. Each rupee he earned from helping his mother felt like a triumph. By the time he was 12, he could buy a small box of nuts and bolts from a dusty corner shop, precious pieces of metal that clinked softly in his hand and fueled his growing fascination with machinery. One especially important figure in Bilal's life was his grandfather, a retired rickshaw driver named Hafiz. Hafiz would sit on a wooden stool outside the house, propping his legs on a wooden crate, and share tales of the old days. He described how he once navigated through monsoon floods, balancing his rickshaw through knee-deep water to transport passengers who needed to reach the hospital in time. Bilal listened with wide eyes, picturing the churning waters and the worried faces of those he helped. Though Hafiz's stories were often about strength and endurance, they also highlighted the value of kindness. On more than one occasion, young passengers couldn't afford the fare, and Hafiz would smile and tell them to go home safely without paying. To Bilal, such small acts of generosity felt heroic. He resolved that someday he too would help people in need, even if he had only tiny resources to offer. When he turned 16, Bilal took a bold step. He approached a local mechanic named Jamal and asked to be his apprentice. Jamal's workshop sat at the end of a narrow alley, where the scent of motor oil mingled with the sweet fragrance of roadside chai. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves holding gears, spark plugs, oil, filters, and rows of wrenches hanging in neat order. Every piece of dust-laden equipment seemed to beckon Bilal forward, promising new secrets to uncover. Jamal was a gruff but fair man. He agreed to teach Bilal in exchange for help with simple tasks: sweeping the workshop floor, fetching drinking water, and passing tools during repairs. In the sweltering heat of midday, when sweat beaded on Bilal's forehead, Jamal would teach him how to identify a worn-out clutch plate or how to adjust the carburetor for smoother acceleration. Under Jamal's guidance, Bilal learned to distinguish the sound of a healthy engine from one on the verge of complete failure. He honed the skill of listening to metal, of feeling the subtle vibrations through his hands when he touched a bicycle chain or an axle. The real test came when Bilal was 18 and he attempted his first solo bike repair. A customer brought in an old motorcycle that sputtered and stalled every few kilometers. With nothing more than a small toolkit and the knowledge he had gained, Bilal removed the fuel tank, cleaned the clogged carburetor jets, and replaced a worn spark plug with a slightly used one scavenged from Jamal's stock. He wiped his oily hands on a rag and turned the key, listening as the engine roared to life with a steady hum. The relief and pride that flooded Bilal at that moment were nearly overwhelming. He handed the keys back to the young rider, who paid him with a nod of respect and rode off into the dusty street. That brief exchange cost Bilal only a few rupees, but it told him everything about his worth. That skill, determination, and a gentle touch could make a difference in someone's day. After his apprenticeship, Bilal helped around Jamal's workshop whenever he could, but he harbored a dream that went beyond being an apprentice. He wanted his own workspace, his own garage where he would call the shots, learn from his mistakes, and maybe even build something unique. Day by day, he saved fragments of his earnings in a small metal box hidden beneath his bed. 10 rupees, here 20 rupees there, small sums that in time grew into a modest nest egg. His mother urged caution, reminding him that their family was still struggling to keep food on the table. But Bilal was determined. He carried that little box with him everywhere, convinced that his future depended on taking a risk. By the time he reached 25, the day he had longed for finally arrived. He found a corrugated metal shed down a side street where rent was 50 rupees a month, a price far lower than other workshops, but the building was barely more than a rusted shell with a single pit dug into the floor for working under vehicles. In typical Karachi fashion, the walls were covered in faded posters advertising new pickup trucks and motor oil brands. The roof leaked during rains, and the floor was cracked, with weeds sprouting in the corners. Yet Bilal saw possibility where others saw ruin. He scraped together his savings to pay the first month's rent and bought a few basic tools: a worn-out jack, a set of wrenches missing a couple of sizes, and a single headlamp to illuminate his workspace at night. He painted his name, Bilal Ahmed, in bold letters, on a scrap of plywood and hung it crookedly above the entrance. At last, he felt ownership of a place he could call his own. The early days in that garage were a struggle. Many mechanics in the area already had established reputations, so new customers were scarce. Bilal spent entire days sitting on a battered wooden stool, watching his neighbors pass by, wondering if anyone would trust him with their vehicle. He kept his prices low, uncomfortably low, just to attract attention. When a street vendor's bicycle chain snapped, he seized the opportunity. He fixed it quickly, refusing any payment beyond a smile and an appreciative nod. Soon, word of mouth spread. "Have you seen that young mechanic in the little shed? He fixed my cart's wheel free of charge." As more people came, Bilal felt a surge of hope. He began to understand that earning respect mattered as much as earning money. Every rickshaw operator, every anxious delivery boy who watched him tighten a lug nut, reinforced his belief that skill and honesty could build trust. Night. After night, Bilal stayed late in the garage, hunched over a table lit by a single flickering bulb. He kept a small pile of scrap metal tucked in the corner, old sprockets, bent bike frames, dented fenders. When times were slow, he took each piece in his hands and imagined how it could fit into something new, perhaps a makeshift lamp, or a simple iron frame for a rickshaw seat. Though he had no formal training beyond Jamal's lessons, creativity flowed through him, and he sketched ideas on scraps of newspaper whenever a customer's story sparked his imagination. Those sketches were raw and Bilal worked late into the evening, wiping his brow with the back of his hand as he finished tightening the last bolt on a rickshaw's wheel. The single headlamp above him flickered, casting shifting shadows on the metal walls of his small garage. Outside, the sky had deepened into a navy blue, and the call to prayer echoed through the narrow streets. He leaned on the rickshaw for a moment, savoring the brief quiet after a long day spent fixing engines and listening to customers' worries. He felt a mixture of fatigue and pride. Every repair, no matter how small, meant that someone's journey on the road might be a bit safer or smoother. As Bilal gathered his tools, he heard a soft thud from the far corner of the garage. At first, he thought it might be a piece of scrap metal falling or perhaps the wind rattling the loose sheets of corrugated metal overhead. He paused, ears straining. The sound came again, softer this time but unmistakably human. He reached for the kerosene lamp hanging on a hook and made his way toward the noise. His bare feet felt the cold concrete floor beneath them, and he stepped carefully over stray tools and bits of wire that were scattered like breadcrumbs around the workspace. When he reached the back of the garage, his breath caught in his throat. Slumped against the wall was a young girl whose clothes were torn and stained with dust. Her long hair was tangled, and her face had smudges of dirt and tiny streaks of red. He knelt beside her, gently placing one hand on her shoulder. Her skin was cool to the touch, and she shivered slightly as he brushed a lock of hair away from her forehead. He knelt lower and saw the cut, not too deep, but enough that a thin ribbon of dried blood marked her brow. She whispered, her voice soft and shaky. "Help me, please." Bilal's heart raced. He had never encountered anything like this in his humble garage. His first thought was fear of what might happen if someone recognized him as unwillingly harboring a stranger, especially a wounded girl, in his own space. He knew the local police could be suspicious of anyone they felt was hiding something. Yet the moment he looked into her eyes, he saw desperation and panic. He could not simply walk away. He scooped her up in his strong arms and carried her to the old wooden workbench, placing her down gently. She winced as he moved her, and he whispered, "I'm here. You're safe." His mind spun with questions. How did she get here? Was she injured in an accident, or was someone trying to hurt her? Even as he tried to calm himself, sweat beaded on his forehead. He rummaged through a small box under the bench and found a clean cloth. Pressing it gently to the wound on her forehead, he could feel her skin under the cloth growing warm with trickling blood. He applied firm but gentle pressure, hoping to slow any further bleeding. She closed her eyes, breathing unevenly, as though each inhale was an effort. Bilal realized she needed medical care right away. He closed the garage door quietly and lifted the lantern higher so that he could see the narrow path leading to the street. The air outside was cooler but still muggy. He checked to make sure no one was watching, then carried her to his old bicycle, which he had propped against the wall. He carefully laid her across the back seat and balanced her head on a folded coat while he pedaled as fast as he could toward the small clinic 2 streets over. Each turn of the bicycle wheels echoed in his ears as he negotiated potholes and uneven pavement. The wind brushed against his shirt, but fear pressed heavily on his chest as he imagined what might happen if someone recognized them. At the clinic's gate, a worn metal sign read 24-hour health center, but at this late hour it was usually closed. Still, Bilal knew the night guard, an elderly man who sometimes let him in when someone urgently needed help. Bilal called out softly, "Pi, it's me, Bilal." The guard shuffled to the gate and glanced at them with tired eyes. When he saw the girl, he hesitated, but Bilal pressed a few coins into his hand and begged him to open the gate. Reluctantly, the guard unlocked the door. Bilal lifted the girl from the bicycle and carried her inside as a pair of dim lights flickered to life in the hallway. A young nurse rushed forward, her calm voice cutting through the tension. "What happened?" she asked. Bilal explained. "I found her injured in my garage. This is a cut on her forehead and she might need stitches." The nurse nodded, busying herself with gloves and antiseptic. "Lay her on the cot. I'll get the doctor." Bilal placed the girl gently on the cot, holding her hand to reassure her. Her eyelids fluttered open. When she saw the bright lights and several unfamiliar faces, she recoiled slightly. "Please, don't let them find me," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Bilal squeezed her hand, offering what comfort he could, though his own heart was pounding. The nurse narrowed her eyes at the mention of someone looking for her. She whispered to Bilal, "Are you sure it's safe to keep her here? If the police come looking, things could get complicated." Bilal nodded, unwilling to risk leaving her on the street. He looked at the small room, its crumbling plaster walls and a single fan that spun lazily overhead. It was not ideal, but it was better than leaving her alone. He placed a blanket around her shoulders to keep her warm and left a small lantern on the bedside table, so she would not wake up in pitch darkness. The doctor arrived in minutes, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and practiced hands. He gently cleaned the wound with antiseptic, and Bilal watched closely, noticing how the girl's breathing slowed as the doctor cleaned the cut. With careful precision, the doctor stitched the wound, ensuring it would heal cleanly. He then examined her arms and legs, checking for any other injuries. He found bruises that looked like they were at least a day old. "She's lucky you found her," he told Bilal quietly. "But these bruises, it seems she's been through more than a simple fall. I'll report this to the authorities, but I'll try to keep her here until morning if that's okay with you." Bilal nodded, grateful for the doctor's understanding. He reached into his pocket and pulled out all the coins he had, 50 rupees in total, to cover the cost of stitches and basic medicines. The nurse pocketed the money. Bilal's stomach churned. He had little left to pay rent or buy food for the next few days. As he handed over the coins, he thought of his sisters and his mother, who would worry if he came home without his usual meal of warm parathas from the stall down the street. That night, Bilal walked back to his garage, feeling the weight of the lonely street lamps overhead. He considered returning to collect more coins, but every second he waited meant the girl might suffer without help. He resolved to tell his family a vague story in the morning, hoping they would understand why he had to spend his savings. The night air smelled faintly of jasmine from a nearby garden, but the scent did little to calm his nerves. When he reached home, his mother was already asleep, and his sisters lay on mats beside her, their soft breathing rhythmic. He quietly sneaked in, removed his shoes at the threshold, and placed them neatly outside. He didn't want them to worry, so he lay on the floor and stared at the ceiling, imagining the girl's face, wondering if she would be safe in the morning. As dawn broke, Bilal was up before anyone else. He fetched water from the well outside and washed his face, trying to shake off the lingering fatigue. He tiptoed into the kitchen and lit a small stove, heating milk for tea. His mind buzzed with worry. Would the police come asking questions? Would they blame him for hiding a runaway or worse? He feared they might suspect him of wrongdoing simply because the girl had been found in his garage. Even as he prepared tea for his family, he planned what to say, that he had found her injured and taken her to the clinic. Yet he dreaded the reactions he might face. After sipping a quick cup of tea, Bilal made his way back to the clinic. When he arrived, the nurse greeted him silently, nodding toward the door of the small room where the girl had been placed. He entered slowly, half expecting to find her gone or worse. To his relief, she was there, sitting up on the cot, her eyes wide and frightened. She was wearing a simple shalwar kameez, and a thin blanket was wrapped around her shoulders. The doctor was present as well, reviewing a small chart. When the girl saw Bilal, tears brimmed in her eyes. "You came," she whispered. "I thought I was alone." Bilal knelt beside her cot. "You're not alone," he said softly. You'll be safe now. Her name, she told him, was Aisha. She was 17 and had been living with an uncle she barely knew since her parents died. She refused to say much more, simply shaking her head whenever anyone asked for details about how she was hurt. Bilal sensed she was afraid of telling her story. He squeezed her hand gently and promised, "I won't let anyone force you into a place you don't want to go." The nurse brought fresh bandages and a small cup of warm water for Aisha to wash her face. Bilal noticed a bruise on her arm and a scrape on her knee, though the doctor assured him that none of the injuries were life-threatening. She would need time to recover. Yet as Bilal paid the nurse another small sum, a loan he hoped to repay, soon, he felt the full burden of what he had done. He had used up most of his savings. He reminded himself, though, that helping another human being was worth the sacrifice. Outside the clinic, the morning bustle began to pick up. Street vendors set up their carts. Bicycle horns sounded from a distance and the aroma of fresh bread wafted through. Bilal woke early carrying a small bag of food and a worried heart. He had spent a sleepless night planning how to keep Aisha safe. After a brief prayer, he hurried to the women's shelter hidden behind small shops near the railway. The building looked plain outside, painted in pastel colors with a simple cloth sign reading, "Safe Home for Women." Inside, it smelled of soap and fresh linen. A few women sat quietly on plastic chairs. Bilal explained Aisha's situation to the manager, a woman named Nayab who listened with kind eyes. He described the girl's injuries and the danger from her uncle. Nayab nodded, asking about Aisha's condition and what belongings she had. Bilal answered, promising to return with clothes and money. Back at the clinic, Bilal found Aisha, wrapped in a thin blanket. When she saw him, her eyes filled with relief. He knelt beside her cot, took her hand, and nodded. Nurse Ali helped them lift her into Bilal's arms, and he carried her to the bicycle. He balanced her head on a coat and pedaled slowly through quiet streets toward the shelter, each turn of the wheels echoing his concern. At the shelter, Sarah and another staff member helped carry Aisha inside. A nurse cleaned and redressed her wounds, and women from the shelter offered water and bandages. Aisha lay back, breathing more easily now that she felt safe. Bilal spoke with Sarah about her needs, clothes, blankets, and money for medication. Sarah promised to keep him updated. Bilal left feeling a new purpose stirring in his chest. Riding. Back to his garage, Bilal thought of explaining everything to his parents. They would worry about his safety and the money he had spent. He also wondered if his savings would run out. Despite these fears, he felt a determined calm. He had helped someone in need. At the garage, customers waited in the heat. Engines cooled as he greeted each politely and set to work. His first task was fixing a motorbike chain. As he tightened nuts and adjusted cables, his thoughts drifted to Aisha. He needed to bring more supplies to the shelter, but every minute spent worrying meant less time for repairs. Midday, Iqbal, a rickshaw driver and neighbor, arrived. He parked and sat on a crate. "I heard about the girl," he said quietly. "Why risk so much?" Bilal paused, wiping sweat from his forehead. "She was in danger," he replied. Iqbal shook his head. "People will talk. Be careful." He handed over 3 homemade samosas. "Eat. And remember, someone is always watching." Bilal accepted the food and returned to work. As evening approached, Bilal closed the garage early. He locked the gate, grabbed a bag of clothes and some coins, and rode to the shelter. The setting sun cast long shadows, and streetlights flickered on. At the shelter gate, Aisha waited, wearing a simple shalwar kameez and looking both anxious and hopeful. "Thank you," she whispered. He helped her inside and handed over the clothes and money. She pressed his hand in gratitude. Before leaving, Bilal spoke with Sarah about finding a volunteer lawyer to help Aisha secure legal papers and protection. Sarah promised to arrange a meeting. Bilal nodded and walked back to his bicycle, aware that his life was changing. He was not just a mechanic anymore, he was a guardian. The next morning, Bilal rose before dawn. He filled 2 plastic bags with rice, flour, and a few rupees, then delivered them to the shelter. The women greeted him with warm smiles as he handed over the supplies. He then headed to the garage for his repairs. In the late afternoon, he returned to the shelter. Aisha had begun helping the other girls tidy the courtyard. She smiled when she saw him. "I feel safe here," she told him. Bilal patted her shoulder and encouraged her to hold on to her dream of becoming a teacher. He scribbled letters and numbers on a scrap of paper, reminding her that education would open doors. Over the next days, Bilal learned about the shelter's struggles. They lacked funds for food, medicine, and school supplies. Sarah told him many girls had nowhere else to go. Bilal wanted to do more. Late one night, he sketched an idea: an open garage day where neighbors could bring broken items to repair and donate a small amount. By dawn, he taped a sign to the garage door: "Fix and help, donations welcome." On that day, curious neighbors arrived with old radios, fans, and bicycles. Bilal and his friend Jamal worked together to repair each item while collecting coins in a small metal box labeled "For Aisha's Care." Some brought homemade snacks and chai to keep the effort going. Rashid, an auto parts shop owner, arrived and offered a discount on spare parts for anyone donating more than 20 rupees, encouraging more people to participate. By sunset, the small garage had become a hub of goodwill. Neighbors exchanged stories and strangers felt united in helping Aisha. Bilal felt joy. His idea had brought the community together. In the days that followed, Bilal discovered new strength. His shoulders, once burdened by worry, now felt lighter. Though the garage still faced slow times, he worked with renewed energy. When customers dropped coins into the donation box, he thanked them, telling them their kindness gave Aisha hope. At the shelter, Aisha's health improved. She joined an evening class where a volunteer taught reading and writing. Bilal visited after work, sitting under the shade of a banyan tree. He brought stories from the workshop: a motorbike that roared, back to life, a fan that hummed steadily. Aisha listened eagerly, her eyes bright. She shared her hopes, teaching children in her village one day so they would never give up their dreams. On a warm evening, as he closed the garage, Bilal paused and looked at the dusty street bathed in golden light. He thought of Aisha, safe, in the shelter, and whispered a silent prayer for her future. He realized that by helping one person, he had found his own path. His life had changed. The garage, once just a place to fix machines, had become a place of hope. He turned off the headlamp and rested, ready for tomorrow. The next morning, Bilal woke with a sense of hope. He walked to the shelter before sunrise, carrying a small bag of fresh parathas and chai. When he entered the courtyard, he saw Aisha sitting on a low bench under a neem tree, her eyes bright with gratitude. She reached out for a paratha, and as she ate, they talked quietly about her plans. By this time, her cut was healing, and the bruises on her arms had faded, but a lingering fear still flickered in her gaze. After Bilal ate and shared a cup of chai with the staff, he headed back to his garage. The drive there felt lighter than usual. Each pedal stroke seemed to lift away the weight he had carried since finding Aisha injured in his workshop. He arrived to find a small queue of customers waiting patiently, bicycles leaning against the gate, and the familiar clack of tools as he opened the workshop door. He greeted each person with a nod and set to work, tightening chains and adjusting brakes, the simple rhythm of repair bringing him comfort. Midway through wiping grease from his hands, Bilal felt a sudden tension in the air. He noticed two men standing across the street watching him closely. One of them wore a fresh button-down shirt as if he had just come from an office, and the other held a small notepad. Bilal felt a flicker of unease. He returned to his work, but kept an eye on the two strangers. They turned and spoke in low tones, pointing toward the shelter's direction, and then back at Bilal's garage. Later that afternoon, Bilal received a call from Sarah, one of the shelter volunteers. "Bilal bhai," she said in a quiet voice. "Something has happened at the shelter. Please come quickly." His heart skipped a beat. He dropped the wrench he held and rushed out the door, locking it behind him. He pedaled as fast as he could, toward the shelter, each push on the pedal fueled by growing concern. Around him, the streets were busy with rickshaws, motorbikes, and the hum of daily life. He navigated through the crowds, sweat beading on his forehead as he imagined the worst. When he arrived, a noisy crowd had gathered outside the shelter's main gate. Some neighbors stood at a distance, whispering to each other. Two police officers, in crisp uniforms, blocked the entrance, their faces set in serious expressions. To one side, a well-dressed man with a neatly trimmed beard paced back and forth. A woman in plain clothes held a clipboard and spoke to the officers in a calm but firm tone. Bilal recognized her as a local journalist named Sana, who had interviewed him once about the open garage donation day. He approached quickly, his heart pounding. He saw Sarah standing beside the officers, her brow furrowed. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice urgent. Sarah turned to him, relief and worry mixing in her expression. "Her uncle is here. He has people who say he is her legal guardian. He wants to take her back, but we believe she is not safe with him." Bilal's stomach tightened. The uncle had powerful connections, Sarah reminded him, and he had already filed some papers claiming custodial rights. "He came with a lawyer, and now the police are telling us they need to verify documents before she can stay here." Bilal swallowed hard. He thought of Aisha, her trembling voice begging him not to let anyone send her back. He squared his shoulders and stepped forward. "We need to protect her," he said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear inside him. "She cannot go back with him." The uncle, a tall man with a slick suit and an air of confidence, stepped closer. He spoke in a firm, polite tone. "I am Aisha's closest living relative. Her parents are gone, and as her uncle, I have the right to bring her home. She must return with me." His voice held a quiet authority that made people shift uneasily. Sarah held up a sheet of paper. "These are police reports indicating possible abuse. Aisha does not want to return. She is fearful for her safety." The uncle's lips pressed together. He glanced at the police officers, who looked uncertain. One officer spoke to the uncle in a low voice, glancing at the reporter and the growing crowd. "We need legal verification. We cannot hold her without a court order." At that moment, Aisha's frail form appeared at a small window on the shelter wall. She looked pale and frightened, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. When she saw her uncle through the glass, her face twisted in fear. Bilal felt a surge of protectiveness as he met her gaze. He gestured to her quietly, mouthing, "Stay strong. I won't let them take you." The uncle's eyes followed Bilal's gesture. "Is this the man who's interfering?" he asked one of the officers. "He's not related. He found her injured by chance." Bilal stepped forward, his hands clenched. Though he was a simple mechanic with no legal training, he refused to step back. "I found her injured and brought her here. I am only trying to help a child in danger." His voice shook slightly, but he held firm. At that moment, Sana, the journalist, raised her camera and began snapping pictures. Other reporters pushed forward, recording the scene on their phones. The air crackled with tension as neighbors emerged from nearby shops to see what was happening. Some whispered, "That's the boy who fixed our rickshaw," or, "He's the one who helped that girl." Sensing the change in the atmosphere, one police officer held up a hand. "Everyone, please stay calm. We will resolve this according to the law." He checked his phone. "There is a legal team from the women's rights organization on the way. Until they arrive, Aisha will remain here." The uncle's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. He turned to leave, flanked by two aides who looked around suspiciously. As soon as he stepped away, Bilal noticed stamps from local newspapers being exchanged among residents who had gathered. Whispers grew louder. "Have you seen the photos online? The mechanic standing up to a powerful uncle?" Meanwhile, the women's rights lawyer from the organization arrived in a small car adorned with the group's logo. A tall woman with glasses and a determined look introduced herself to Sarah. She studied Aisha's case files, spoke to the police officers, and assured everyone that she would file a petition to ensure Aisha's safety. The lawyer knelt by Aisha's side, speaking to her gently, promising that no one would force her back. As the crowd dispersed, locals began gathering around Bilal in small clusters. Some offered respectful nods, Others quietly voiced their support. Rashid, the auto parts shop owner, clapped Bilal on the shoulder. "You did the right thing, Bai. This girl needed someone to stand by her." Bilal felt a rush of relief and gratitude. He had never imagined so many people would rally behind a simple mechanic. He thought of the early days in his corrugated sheet and realized how far he had come. He was no longer just a man fixing engines. He had become someone people looked up to. Despite the victory, Bilal knew the battle was not over. The uncle might return with new claims and the court fight could drag on for months. In the meantime, he had to ensure Aisha remained safe. He promised Sarah he would bring more supplies to the shelter and stay in close contact with the lawyer. He also offered to tutor Aisha in basic math and reading as she recovered, knowing that giving her a sense of normalcy would ease her fear. That evening, news of the confrontation spread through social media. A short clip showed Bilal standing defiantly in front of the uncle, his face resolute. The camera capturing the moment the reporter clicked pictures. Comments poured in. "That boy is a hero. Power to the mechanic who stood up for a terrified girl. We need more people like him." By the next morning, local community leaders had arranged a small gathering outside Bilal's garage. A banner reading, "Support for Bilal and Aisha," hung between two poles, hand-painted by neighbors. Women brought homemade snacks and children offered drawings of Bilal and Aisha, their crayons bright against paper. When Bilal stepped outside, he was met with applause and warm smiles. Some offered him cups of chai, and elderly neighbors pressed rupees into the donation box that now sat on a small stool near the entrance. The donations were not large, but each coin represented solidarity, a sign that the community stood beside him. Over the following days, Bilal balanced his time between the garage and the shelter. In the mornings, he would fix rickshaw brakes or change oil filters, and in the afternoons he would visit Aisha to help her with reading lessons. Their sessions were simple: basic alphabets, writing her name, reading short sentences. Aisha blossomed under his patient guidance. She smiled, more often, her fearful glances replaced by determined eyes. Bilal noticed that as she healed emotionally, her physical wounds faded more quickly. At one point, the uncle's lawyer approached the shelter with a court order. The order demanded that Aisha be handed over to her uncle pending a formal hearing. Sarah immediately called Bilal. When he arrived, he found Aisha curled up on a cot, tears in her eyes. She whispered, "They want to take me back." The lawyer stood by, his face stern, holding the court document. Bilal took a deep breath. He recognized that if he refused, he could face legal trouble himself. But he also knew that sending Aisha back could crush her spirit and place her in harm's way. He knelt beside her and said, "We will not let this happen. We will fight for you." He rose and faced the lawyer calmly. "Aisha does not want to go. These bruises on her arms and the stories she told me show she is unsafe with her uncle. We will challenge this order." The lawyer glanced at the police officer present, who looked uncertain. The women's rights lawyer from the previous day stepped forward. She stated firmly, "Aisha's rights must." The courtroom decision echoed in Bilal's mind as he walked back through the busy streets toward his garage. A warm breeze carried the scent of fried samosas and freshly brewed tea, mingling with the sounds of rickshaws and street vendors calling out their wares. Though his clothes were dusty from the day's tensions, Bilal felt a lightness in his chest that he had not known before. He had seen Aisha's relief when the judge ruled in her favor, and he carried that image with him as a new kind of strength. When he reached the shelter that evening, Aisha was waiting by the gate. Her eyes brightened as she saw him approach. She rose from her seat on a simple wooden bench and came forward, her steps unsteady at first but growing more confident with each one. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice quiet but firm. "Because of you, I can sleep without fear." Bilal knelt to meet her gaze. "You have a brave heart," he said. "Never forget that. You will find your own way soon." He offered a small smile, and Aisha returned it, standing a little taller than she had the day before. At the shelter's entrance, the walls were painted in soft pastel tones, with handmade drawings and paper flowers lining the hallways. Young women in simple clothes worked together to prepare dinner, and laughter trickled out of the common room where they gathered around a long wooden table. Aisha slipped inside, and Bilal followed. As they ate lentils and flatbread, the other residents exchanged warm greetings. One of them offered Aisha a small jar of homemade pickles, and another patted her shoulder encouragingly. Bilal watched this scene with a growing sense of pride. In a place once ruled by fear and uncertainty, warmth and companionship now filled the air. After dinner, Bilal sat with the shelter manager Nayab and discussed next steps. They spoke quietly in a side room, away from the others. "We want Aisha to continue her education," Bilal said, smoothing the crease in his own shalwar kameez. "If I can help tutor her, she might catch up on what she has missed. Then she can go back to school, maybe even become a teacher herself one day." Nayab nodded thoughtfully. "That would be wonderful. She has shown so much promise already, and we have other girls here who might benefit from lessons as well." Bilal felt a spark of excitement at the possibility. He imagined a small corner in the shelter set aside for lessons with simple desks and a chalkboard, where children could gather to learn letters and numbers. It seemed like a dream, but he believed it could come true. The next morning, Bilal arrived at the garage before sunrise. The silence of the empty street felt peaceful, a stark contrast to the courtroom's tense atmosphere only a day earlier. He unlocked the corrugated metal door and flipped on the single overhead lamp. As the light flickered on, he ran his hands over the dusty tools laid out on a long wooden bench. He took a deep breath and began cleaning wrenches and oil pans, preparing for the day's work. Yet even as he greased a sprocket or replaced a spark plug, his thoughts drifted to Aisha's future and the lessons he planned to teach her. Throughout that week, Bilal divided his time carefully. In the mornings, he focused on his work at the garage, repairing motorcycles, fixing rickshaws, and tinkering with old car engines. Each repair felt more meaningful now, as if every turn of the wrench contributed to a wider cause. Customers noticed a change in him. When a delivery boy with a dented bicycle came to him for help, Bilal not only fixed the wheel but also took a moment to ask how the boy's sister was doing in school. When a taxi driver arrived complaining of engine trouble, Bilal not only repaired the fault but also slid a folded piece of paper across the counter with the shelter's address, suggesting where the driver could drop off extra blankets or clothes. Word of these small acts spread quickly. "Bilal the mechanic not only fixes my rickshaw but also helps girls in need," people whispered in the markets. By afternoon, he closed the garage briefly and made his way to the shelter. In a quiet room bathed in late afternoon light, he had set up a makeshift classroom. A single desk faced a worn chalkboard that listed the day's lesson. Urdu alphabet numbers 120. Aisha sat at the desk, pencils and notebooks spread before her. When Bilal entered, she flashed a bright smile and waved. Over the next hour, he guided her through simple exercises, tracing letters with her fingers, sounding out syllables, and writing numbers carefully. As she concentrated, the fear that once clouded her eyes seemed to lift. Nearby, other girls watched with interest. When Bilal paused to give extra help to a struggling student, Aisha turned and whispered to a friend, "He makes me feel like I can do anything." Bilal overheard this and felt a surge of joy. His simple teaching was making a real difference in their lives. Evenings at the shelter filled with quiet routines. The girls gathered for prayers, then sat together on thin mats to share stories of their childhood and dreams for the future. Aisha often spoke of her desire to become a teacher, describing how she would return to her village, build a small school under a banyan tree, and teach children who could not afford formal classes. Bilal listened, his heart lifting with each word. He understood that education would be her path to a brighter future. Weekends brought new visitors to the shelter. Local businesses heard about the girls' needs and started sending donations, a roll of fabric for sewing uniforms, boxes of notebooks and pens, and even a second-hand computer from a nearby school. Bilal helped carry these supplies inside, marveling at the generosity of strangers who simply wanted to help. One afternoon, Rashid, the auto parts shop owner, delivered a small gift, a set of paintbrushes and cans of paint for the girls to decorate the shelter's walls. Rashid smiled and said, "Let them paint their dreams onto these walls. Let them see beauty where once there was fear." Bilal nodded, understanding how art could uplift weary spirits. Together, they helped the girls paint bright flowers and hopeful slogans. Knowledge is freedom, and strength in unity. As the weeks passed, Aisha's health continued to improve. The bruise on her arm had faded into a faint scar, and her once timid posture straightened as she grew stronger. One day, Bilal took her to the nearby park where children played cricket on a dusty pitch. He had saved a few coins to buy an affordable cricket set, 2 bats, a ball, and a pair of pads. He taught her how to hold the bat, how to stand at the crease, and how to follow the bowler's wrist. At first she hesitated, but then she swung, connecting with the ball and sending it skimming across the field. A cheer rose up as the girls watching at the boundary clapped and ran forward to retrieve the ball. In that moment, Aisha laughed, freely, her voice echoing in the open space, and Bilal's heart swelled with pride. He realized that healing went beyond medicine. Joy and normalcy were just as powerful. Meanwhile, the legal process moved slowly. The investigation into her uncle's actions required time, and Bilal checked in regularly with the women's rights lawyer. Each meeting brought small victories, a new piece of evidence, a favorable report from a social worker, or a statement from a neighbor who had seen Aisha's uncle's harsh behavior. Bilal attended these meetings, offering moral support and sharing his own observations, how Aisha had come to his garage injured, her fear and reluctance to speak. The lawyer nodded at each detail, filing reports and ensuring the court understood Aisha's vulnerability and her strong wish not to return. Although the process was sometimes frustratingly slow, the momentum gradually shifted toward a final ruling that would secure her safety. One warm afternoon, the women's rights lawyer called Bilal with news. The court had granted temporary custody of Aisha to the shelter until a final hearing. The lawyer's voice crackled with relief. "She will remain safe with you in the shelter," the lawyer said. Bilal closed his eyes and let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. That night he visited Aisha at the shelter. She was in the courtyard trimming a small flower bed outside her room. When she saw him, she jumped up and ran forward, throwing her arms around his waist. "Thank you," she cried. "I can breathe, now." Bilal hugged her gently. "You have done the hard work," he said. "You have survived. Now we move forward together." Over time, the shelter grew into a place not just of safety, but of community and growth. Neighbors volunteered to teach sewing, cooking, and traditional crafts. A retired teacher offered weekly lessons in math and science. Bilal continued his tutoring sessions, introducing simple lessons in basic engineering, how levers worked, why engines roared, and how to fix a broken wheel. The girls beamed as they learned, sometimes kneeling beside him to inspect a small motor or adjust a screw. Their curiosity and enthusiasm reminded him of his younger self, tinkering with broken radios under a dim lantern. By the end of 6 months, a small celebration was held at the shelter, a festive gathering with garlands of marigold flowers, plates of sweet vermicelli, and music playing softly in the background. The community came together, neighbors, customers from Bilal's garage, volunteers, and local officials. Aisha, now in neat school uniform, stood with Bilal at the front. She received a certificate of achievement for her progress in reading and writing, her eyes shining with excitement. When she spoke into the microphone, her voice carried clear and steady. "I want to thank all of you for believing in me. I promise to study hard and one day teach other children who cannot afford school."